We're okay. With a grin, she reached her pocket, found a strip of caribou hide, and thrust it at him. Kapu snatched it, and with one pull, not only wrestled it from her, but sent her sprawling on her back. Tail held high out, he streaked like a rocket across the lichens, turned, and came back with the hide. He shook it in front of her, daring her to take it away. You're much too strong for me now, Kapu, she said no, slowly, going to her feet. I can't play with you anymore. Shaking the hide, she danced, barked, and then ran over the tundra until he was but a speck in the distance. Miax laughed and dragged the caribou leg back to her tent. She cut it and built a small fire. She skinned the rabbit, saving the fur or saving the fur to line her new mitten. As the stew cooked, the crackling cold inspired her to dance. She stepped forward on the vast stage at the top of the world and bowed to her immense audience. Curving her arms out, bending her knees, she hopped on one foot and beat time with the other. Then she glided and shifted her weight gracefully, executing a combination of steps which the bent woman had danced at Seal Camp long ago. When she came to the refrain, however, she did not do the dance about evil spirits, but improvised, as Eskimos do at this point. She told the story of a young wolf who had brought the lost girl a shank of meat and ended the performance with a kapu-like caper. She spun, laughing to stop. She was warm, her blood tingled. Eli, she thought, the old Eskimo customs are not so foolish. They have purpose. I'm as warm as the center of a lemming's nest. As the sky darkened, Kapu came back. He barked softly. I know what you want, she called, holding out a large piece of cooked meat. Kapu took it so gently from her fingers that she could not even feel his teeth. As she watched him run off into the night, her eyes lifted to the sky. There, twinkling in the distance, was the North Star, the permanent light that had guided the Eskimos for thousands of years. She sang, bright star, lead me to the sea. Hastily, she cut the remaining half of her caribou skin into 4 strips in a circle. Cracking open the ice on the lake, she weighed the pieces with stones and sent them to the bottom. Around midnight, she awoke to hear her wolves in the distance talking softly among themselves, probably paying tribute to Amarok as they moved along the trail, she thought. Peering out of her tent, she saw that the star was gone. A cold fleck struck her nose, melted, fell into her fur, and froze. The wind blared, the wolves called joyously, and Miak snuggled deep in her furs. Let it snow. Kapu had known it was coming and had brought food for her. She slept until daybreak, saw that it was still snowing, and dozed off and on through the white, wild day as the weasels and the foxes did. That night, the sky cleared, and at dawn she crawled out of her skins. The tundra was white with snow that would lock up the Arctic till June. The cold had deepened. After breakfast, she cracked open the lake ice again, pulled out the water-soaked circle, and laid it out on the ground. Using her man's knife, she turned up the edges, tied them in place, and let the cup freeze in the air. As it hardened, she stepped into the bottom, trampled it into a bowl, and then cut 2 holes in the sides. Through these she ran the leather thongs and tied them together. Next, she took 2 strips of skin from the water and held them in place while they froze to the bottom of the bowl. in the shape of flat rockers, then stood up. Her sled was done. Working quietly, she had only a few hours of daylight. She formed the tear-shaped hoops out of the last two strips. Then she laid out to freeze. These she laid out to freeze. When they were solid, she webbed them with hide, made loops from her toes, and put on her snowshoes. They crackled and snapped, but kept her up on the drifts. Now she could travel the top of the snow. She cut the rest of the caribou leg into bite-sized chunks and stored them in her sled. Then, adjusting her mittens in the darkness, she took a bearing on the North Star and started off. Her icy sled jingled over the windswept lakes, and she sang as she traveled. The stars grew brighter as the hours passed, and the tundra began to glow, for the snow reflected each twinkle a billion times over, turning the night to silver. By this light she could see the footsteps of the wolves. She followed them, for they were going her way. Just before sunrise, the wolf prints grew closer together. They were slowing down for sleep. She felt their presence everywhere. She could not see them. Running out on the lake, she called. Shadows flickered on the top of a frost heap. There they were. She quickened her stride. She would camp with them and do the dance of the wolf pup feeding the lost girl from Kapu. He would surely run in circles when he saw it. The shadows flattened as she walked, and by the time she returned, the other shore they had turned into sky and vanished. There were no footsteps in the snow to say her pack had been there, and she knew the Arctic dawn had tricked her eyes. Frost spirits, she said, as she pitched her tent by the lake and crawled into bed. By the yellow and green light of the low noon sun, Miax could see that she had camped on the edge of the wintering grounds of the caribou. Their many gleaming antlers formed a forest on the horizon. Such a herd would certainly attack her pack. She crawled out of bed and saw that she had pitched her tent in a tiny forest about 3 inches high. Her heart pounded excitedly, for she had not seen one of these willow groves since Nunavut. She was making progress, for they grew not near Barrow, but in slightly warmer and wetter lands near the coast. She smelled the air in hopes that it bore the salty odor of the ocean, but it smelled only coal. The dawn cracked and hummed, and the snow was so fine that it floated above the ground when a breeze stirred. Not a bird passed overhead. The buntings, lawns, long spurs, and terns were gone from the top of the world. A willow ptarmigan, the chicken of the tundra, clucked behind her and whistled softly as it hunted seeds. The Arctic Circle had been returned to its permanent bird resident, the hardy ptarmigan. The millions of voices of summer had died down to one plaintive note. Ah, 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 ah. Miax sat up, wondering what that was. Creeping halfway out of her bag, she peered into the sky to see a great brown bird maneuvering its wings and speed west. A skua. She was closer to the ocean than she thought, for the skua is a bird of the coastal waters of the Arctic. As her eyes followed it, they came to rest on an oil drum, the signpost of American civilization in the north. How excited she would have been to see this a month ago. Now she was not so sure. She had her ulo and needles, her sled, her tent, and the world of her ancestors. And she liked the simplicity of that world. It was easy to understand. Out here, she understood how she fitted into the scheme of the moon and the stars and the constant rise and fall of life on the earth. Even the snow was part of her. She melted it and drank it. Amarok barked. He resounded as if he was no more than a quarter-mile away. Ooh, ooh, she called. Nails answered, and then the whole pack howled briefly. I'm over here, she shouted joyously, jumping up and down. Here by the lake. She paused. You know that. You know everything about me all the time. The wind began to rise as the sun started back to the horizon. The lake responded with a boom sounded like a pistol shot. The freeze was deepening. Mayak lit a fire and put on her pot. A warm stew would taste good, and the smoke and flames would make the tundra home. Presently, Amarok barked forcefully, and the pack answered. Then the royal voice sounded from another position, and Silver checked in from across the lake. Nails gave a warning snarl, and the pups whispered in woofs. Miak shaded her eyes. Her wolves were barking from points around a huge circle, and she was in the middle. This was strange. They almost always stayed together. Suddenly, Amarok barked ferociously, his voice angry and authoritative. Silver yelped, and Nails and Kapu. They had something at bay. She stepped onto the lake and skipped towards them. Halfway across, she saw a dark head rise above the hill, and a beast with a head as large as the moon rose to its hind feet, massive paws swinging. Grizzly, she gasped and stopped stone still as the huge animal rushed onto the ice. Amarok and Nails leapt at its face and sprang away before the bear could strike. They were heading it off, trying to prevent it from crossing. The bear snarled, lunged forward, and galloped towards Miax. She ran toward her tent. The wind was in her face, and she realized she was upwind of the bear, her scent blowing right to him. She darted off in another direction, for bears have poor eyesight and can track if they and cannot track if they cannot smell. Slipping and sliding, she reached the south bank as the grizzly staggered forward, then tumbled to its knees and sat down. She wondered why he was not in hibernation. The wolves had been sleeping all day. They could not have wakened the bear. She sniffed the air to try to smell the cause, but only odorless ice crystals stung her nose. The pack kept harassing the sleeping beast, barking and snarling, but with no intention of killing it. They were simply trying to drive it away from her, she realized. Slowly, the bear got to its feet and permitted itself to be herded up the lake bank and back to where it had come from. Reluctantly, blindly, it staggered before the wolves. Occasionally, it stood like a giant, but mostly it roared in the agony of sleepiness. Yapping, barking, darting, the wolves drove the grizzly far out on the tundra. Finally, they veered away, breaking into a joyous gallop, dashed over the snow and out of sight. Their duty was done. They were running, not to hunt, not to kill, but simply for fun. Miex was trembling. She had not realized the size and ferocity of the dark bear of the north, who was called grizzly inland and brown bear along the coast, Ursus arctos. Large ones like the grizzly her wolves had driven away weighed over 1,000 pounds and stood 9 feet tall when they reared. Miex wiped a bead of perspiration from her forehead. Had he come upon her tent with one curious sweep of his paw, he would have snuffed out her life while she slept. Amarok, Nails, Kapu, she called. I thank you. I thank you. As she As she packed to travel on, she thought about her escorts. Wolves did not like civilization, for they had once dwelt all over North America. They now lived in remote parts of Canada, in only 2 of the lower 48 states, and in the wilderness of Alaska. Even the roadless North Slope had fewer wolves than it did before the Gusaks erected their military bases and brought airplanes, snowmobiles, electricity, and jeeps to the Arctic. As she thought about the Gusach, she suddenly knew why the brown bear was awake. The American hunting season had begun. Her wolves were in danger. The Gussacks were paid to shoot them. A man who brought in the left ear of a wolf to the warden was rewarded with a bounty of $50. The bounty was evil to the old men at Seal Camp, for it encouraged killing for money rather than for need. Capuchin considered the bounty the Gussack way of deciding that the Amarocks could not live on this earth anymore. And no men have that right, he would say. When the wolves are gone, there will be too many caribou grazing the grass and the lemmings will starve. Without the lemmings, the foxes and the birds and the weasels will die. Their passing will end smaller lives upon which that even man depends, whether he knows it or not, and the talk of the world will pass into silence. Miax was worried. The oil drum she had seen when the skua flew over marked the beginning of civilization and the end of the wilderness. She must warn her pack of the danger ahead. She had learned too many things to them, to say many things to them, but now the most important of all was the ear twist or the bark that would turn them back. She did not know. How, she thought, do I shout, "Go away, go far away"? She sang, "Go away, royal wolf, go away, do not follow. I am a gun at your head when I pass the oil drum." Threads of clouds spun up from the earth and trailed across the tundra. They marked the beginning of the whiteout. Miax changed her plans to travel that night, crept into her shelter, and watched the air turn, watched the air turn white as the snow arose from the ground and hung all around her. She closed her tent flap and took out her pot. In it, she cut a piece of fat from the bladder bag and a scrape of sinew. She lit the sinew and a flame illuminated her tiny home. She took out the comb. As she carved that, she saw that it was not a comb at all, but Amarok. The teeth were his legs, the handle his head. He was waiting to be released from the bone. Surprised to see him, she carved carefully for hours and finally let him out. His neck was arched, his head and tail were lifted. Even his ears had a message. "I love you," they said. A bird called faintly in the dark. Miax wondered what kind it was and what it was doing so far north at this date. Too sleepy to think, she unlaced her boots, undressed, and folded her clothes. The bird called from the edge of the sleeping skin, holding her candle above her head. She crept toward the door and peered into the bright eyes of a golden plover. He was young. He wore the splotch plumage of the juvenile and still had a trace of baby yellow around his beak. He slumped about her against her skins. Gently, she slipped him in her hand under her feet, picked him up and brought him close to her. His black and gold feathers gleamed in the sputtering light. She had never held a plover so closely and now understood why Capuchin had called them the spirit of the birds. The plover's golden eyes and red nose made it look like one of the dancers in the bladder feast. "You are lost," she said. "You should be far from here, perhaps in Labrador, perhaps even in your winter home on the plains of Argentina. And so you are dying. You need insects and meat, but I'm so glad you're here." Then she added, "I shall call you Tornate, the spirit, the bird spirit." She eased the bird into her warming sleeping skin, cut off a piece of caribou meat, and held it out. Tornate ate ravenously, then rested. She fed him once more, and then he tucked his head into his black feathers and went to sleep. The following night, the whiteout was still so dense she could not see the ground where she crept out for snow to melt and drink. Oh, I won't go out tonight, she said to Tornate when she came inside. But I do not care. I have food, light, furs, fire, and a pretty companion. That evening she polished her carving of Amarok and talked to Tornate. The plover was incredibly tame, perhaps because he lived in the most barren parts of the world where there were no people, perhaps because he was lonely. Tornate ran over her skins, flitted to her head and shoulders, and sang when she sang. On the on the on the next afternoon, the whiteout was but a frosty mist. Miex was cooking dinner when Tornate drew his feathers to his body and stood up in alarm. She listened for a long time before she heard the ocean scream as footsteps pressed it. Scrambling to the door, she saw Capo in the midst, frost on his whiskers. Hi, she called. He did not turn around, for he was looking at something in the distance. Presently, Amarok swept into view and stopped beside him. Amarok, she shouted. Amarok, how are you? Tossing her head in wolf happiness, she crawled out of her tent on all fours and nudged him under the chin. He arched his back grandly. Then, with a glance at Kapu, he ran out on the lake. The young wolf followed and laughed joyously. Miex crawled after them both. She had not gone far before Amarok stopped and glared at her. She stayed where she was. The regal pair skipped away, snow billowing up from their strides like smoke. Getting to her knees, she looked for Silver Nails and the pups, but they did not follow the pair. Miex rocked back on her heels. Could it be that the leader of the pack was teaching the leader of the pups? She noted slowly as she comprehended. Of course, to be a leader requires not only fearlessness and intelligence, but experience and schooling. The head of the wolf pack needed to be trained, and who better to do this than Amarok? And I will know what you teach, she called out. You'll teach him which animal to harvest. You'll teach him to make decisions. You'll teach him how to close in on a caribou and where to bed the wolf pack down. And you'll teach him to love and protect. The whiteout vanished, the stars blazed out, and San Francisco called to Miex. It was time to move on. Kapu was now in school. But how shall I tell them not to follow me any more? She asked Tornate as she crawled back into her tent. Of course, she gasped. She had been told by Amarok himself how to say stay back when he had wanted Kapu alone. He had walked forward, turned around, glared into her eyes. She had stopped in her tracks and gone home. Eagerly, she practiced. She ran forward, looked over her shoulder, and glared. Stay, Amarok. Stay where you are. Humming to herself, she took down her tent, rolled it into a bundle, and threw it on the sled. Then she stuffed the pack and tucked Tornate in the hood of her parka. Sticking her toes in her snowshoes, she took a bearing on the constant star. Then snow squeaked under her feet, and for the first time she felt the dry bite of the cold right through her parka and boots. To her, this meant the temperature was zero, the point of every year when she began to feel chilly. Dancing and swinging her arms to get warm, she picked up the thongs of her sled and walked toward the sea. The sled glided lightly behind her. Okay, boys and girls, that's it for now. I'll be making the last one and posting it tomorrow. And have a good night. Bye-bye.